Yeah. Perfect.
Okay. Es el equipo que trabaja. Esto es lo de Kymlicka, ¿lo puedes decir?
Pues ya que empezar. Well, good morning, everybody. Buenos días. Good morning. We had to start the conference, and it's a great honor for me and pleasure introduce you, Professor Will Kymlicka. Canada is professor in the Canada Research Chair in Political Philosophy at Queen's University in Kingston, Canada, and the co-author with Sue Donaldson of Zoopolis, a political theory of animal rights, very important and influential book of animal rights. Welcome, Professor Kymlicka, and we have to start. And after the conference, we have time around 50 minutes for questions and answers of Professor Kymlicka. Welcome to Mexico and to our university, National University of Mexico. It's a pleasure for us that you are with us this morning. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Lanes. And thanks to the organizers for inviting me. It's great to be back at Minding Animals. So I want to talk about human rights and animal rights. One of the questions that animal rights advocates get all the time, at least in my experience, is why don't you care about human rights? And the short answer is we do care about human rights. The survey data shows, and I'll talk about this later, that people who endorse animal rights tend to be very strong supporters of human rights as well, more so than average citizens. And so animal rights advocates are in fact very consistent supporters of human rights. However, there are often problems from an animal rights point of view with the way human rights are framed and discussed. Much of the discourse around human rights has been framed in a way that is complicit in or invokes species hierarchy, invokes ideas of human supremacy over animals. And in that way, the human rights discourse is complicit in what I think many of us view as a kind of ongoing moral catastrophe of our relations with animals. I won't give you all the numbers. Rod went through that in his talk. And the way in which the human rights discourse has appealed to ideas of species hierarchy has made it, I think, as I say, complicit in some of that mistreatment of animals, and has helped to reinforce the idea of species entitlement that many humans have to use animals for our own purposes. And this link between species hierarchy and human rights goes back really to the beginning of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948. So one of the first and foremost theorists of the Universal Declaration, Jacques Maritain, when he was explaining to the world what was the point of having a Universal Declaration of Human Rights, he said, and I quote, that the purpose of human rights is to insist on the radical distinction between persons and all other beings, to elevate humanity above animality, and to liberate humanity from the animality which enslaves him. So for Maritain and many of the other people involved in the Universal Declaration, it was crucial that human rights are above elevating humanity above animals. And a more recent expression of the same idea is in George Ktab's recent book, in which he says, and I quote, "The core idea of human dignity is that on Earth, humanity is the greatest type of being, and that every member deserves to be treated in a manner consistent with the high worth of the species." So we've got a long history of connecting the defense of human rights to the idea of human supremacy. And as an animal rights advocate, I would like to find a way of talking about human rights that doesn't involve invoking species hierarchy. And that's basically what I want to do in the talk, is explore different ways of thinking about human rights without invoking species hierarchy. And I think it's worth noting that despite Maritain and Ktab, not all of the discourses around human rights invoke the idea of species hierarchy. And in a way, one way to think about this is that when Jacques Maritain was writing in 1948, invoking ideas of species hierarchy, that was before there had really been any kind of animal rights movement, at least in the Western democracy. There were no organized animal rights organizations. This was, and so when he talked about that the purpose of human rights was to elevate humans above animals, he was just expressing ideas that were taken for granted by virtually everyone in his audience. He didn't think of himself as making a controversial claim. No one at the time was really contesting ideas of species hierarchy. But since the 1970s, we've had sustained intellectual criticisms of the idea of species hierarchy. And so defenders of human rights since the 1970s have been confronted. They can't just take as a given the idea of species hierarchy. They know that there is this significant literature criticizing arguments for species hierarchy. And so they've been confronted with the question of whether they want to base their defenses of human rights on the idea of species hierarchy, the way that Jacques Maritain did. And I think we see a movement from the 1980s forward that at least some theorists of human rights have deliberately decided not to base their defense of human rights on human supremacism. So, for example, again, in the 1980s, some of the first actually book-length discussions of the theories of human rights in the English language by Henry Shue or James Nichol or Joel Feinberg, they all offered what I take to be a non-supremacist theory of human rights, in which they basically argued humans have some what they called essential basic interests or essential interests, which are subject to some standard threats, and the purpose of human rights is to protect the basic interests from these standard threats. And that way of thinking about human rights does not inherently preclude the possibility that animals also might have basic interests or essential interests and might also face standard threats and therefore might be entitled to rights. And indeed, Feinberg, in a famous article, acknowledged that. He said that it was quite consistent with his account of rights that animals too could be bearers of rights. And James Nichol has a footnote in his book on human rights saying that he acknowledges that it's possible that the logic of his defense of human rights could also defend animal rights. I should emphasize that neither Feinberg nor Nichol actually come out and defend animal rights, but I still call them non-supremacist theories of human rights because they left it as an open question whether their justification for human rights could also be a justification for animal rights. And that's different from Maritain. So for Maritain, it was part of the success of a theory of human rights that it not just defend the idea that humans have rights, but it must also show that animals do not have rights. So that's what I'm calling a supremacist theory of human rights, one which does not only seek to show that humans have rights, but also tries to show that animals do not have rights. That's a supremacist theory of human rights. And so Jacques Maritain and Georges Ktab and others that I'll go on to discuss have supremacist theory of human rights, but Feinberg and Nichol and Shue did not. They left it as it wasn't a test, from their point of view, it was not a test of success of a theory of human rights that it must exclude the possibility that animals have rights. And I think that way of thinking, this kind of non-supremacist account of human rights, which emerged in the 1980s, actually developed further in the 1990s and into the 2000s. We actually saw a kind of explosion of theories of human rights in the 1990s and 2000s, and a new array of ways of thinking about human rights, all of which were non-supremacist on my definition. So, for example, Martha Feynman developed an account of human rights based on the idea of vulnerability, that the purpose of human rights is to protect vulnerability. Martha Nussbaum and Amartya Sen developed an account of human rights that are about capabilities and flourishing. Fiona Robinson developed a theory of human rights based on a feminist ethics of care. Judith Butler developed an account of human rights as protecting precarious life. So these were all new and, in my view, innovative ways of thinking about human rights that actually enriched the kind of moral vocabulary we have for discussing human rights. So Feinberg and Shu had this quite Spartan vocabulary of interests and needs. And in the 1990s and 2000s, it was enriched with these ideas of capabilities, vulnerability, subjectivity, precariousness. And all of these are non-supremacist defenses of human rights in the sense that they leave open the question whether those ideas are also applicable to animals and whether these could also be grounds for claiming that animals have rights. And because they left that as an open question, animal rights theorists, including some people in this audience, took those ideas and pushed them towards developing accounts of animal rights. So Annie Satz took Martha Feynman's account of vulnerability and showed how it could be used to defend rights for animals. Martha Nussbaum herself took her account of capabilities theory as a grounds for human rights and showed how it could be used to defend animal rights. Various care ethicists, including Laurie Gruen and Carol Adams, have shown how a care-based account can be applied to defend animal rights. Chloe Taylor and others have shown how Judith Butler's idea of human rights as a protection for precarious life can be applied to animals who also clearly have precarious life in our society. So in the 1990s and 2000s, we actually had this, in my view, quite interesting moment in which we were developing a richer vocabulary for discussing human rights, and it was a vocabulary that opened up the question, allowed for exploration of the continuities between animal rights and human rights, because all of these ideas, vulnerability, precariousness, capabilities, highlight things that are continuous between humans and animals. And so as I say, they opened up what in my view was an important debate about the continuities between human rights and animal rights. However, in the past 10 years, I would say, we have seen a reaction against that, a counter-reaction, let's say, and an attempt in human rights theory to reassert species hierarchy, to reinsert human supremacism into the foundations of human rights. And there are various versions of this, and this is what I'm worried about, is that in the past 10 years, various theorists of human rights have attempted to add back in human supremacism to the defense of human rights. And there, as I say, there are various versions of this, but I want to focus on one which are sometimes called the new dignitarians. So people who put the idea of human dignity at the core of human rights. And they make two claims. So the first is what I've just said, that on this view, the purpose of human rights is to protect human dignity. The second claim is that it's essential to human dignity. Treating a human with dignity just is treating them better than an animal. That it's a constitutive feature of human dignity is the superiority to animals. So those are the two claims that characterize what I'm calling the new dignitarians. Now, I want to emphasize that not everyone who talks about the importance of human dignity endorses that second claim, that it's essential to human dignity that you be treated better than an animal. But it's a very widespread view in the dignitarian literature. And I think it's become quite influential. So one version of this is George Ktab, who I quoted before. So here's a quote from Ktab. All individuals are equal. No other species is equal to humanity. These are the two basic propositions that make up the concept of human dignity. So he's building species hierarchy into his very definition of human dignity. But here's another quote. This is from Catherine Dupre, who's from her book on the jurisprudence of human dignity. So she did a kind of massive overview of how the courts, and particularly European courts, discuss human dignity. So here's her summary of how the courts understand human dignity. The legal system of human rights protection in Europe rests on the assumption that as human beings, we are born with the unique quality of dignity that distinguishes us from other beings, primarily animals, justifying and explaining the special protection of our rights. And then she goes on to give an example of what this means in practice, focusing on the example of work. In the context of work relationships, where employees tend to be considered by employers as disposable and interchangeable production units, the Kantian distinction between value or market price that can be attributed to things and animals, and dignity or intrinsic worth, which is an exclusively human quality, has never been more relevant. So this to my mind, is a kind of paradigmatic expression of the new dignitarians. So it's worth pausing over that passage about work. So here's the situation she's imagining. Employers are mistreating employees. They're instrumentalizing their workers. They're treating their workers in an instrumental way. So what's the response? So some humans are mistreating other humans. Some humans are instrumentalizing other humans. What's the response by the new dignitarians? The response is to say, you're making a mistake. You're instrumentalizing humans. You should be instrumentalizing animals. That is the way she takes to be at the core of the human rights jurisprudence in Europe. So in other words, if some humans are instrumentalizing, are harming, treating unjustly other humans, the response is to throw animals under the bus. That's essential to the new dignitarian jurisprudence. So we can see another example of this at a more philosophical level in the work of Jeremy Waldron. So Waldron has written extensively on human dignity as the basis for human rights. And he develops an account about human dignity based on the idea that humans have a high rank. And what he means by humans having a high rank is partly that he's partly talking about distinctions amongst humans, that historically, for example, peasants had a different rank than aristocrats. And what we've done through the idea of human rights is leveled up, so that certain rights which used to be attributed only to aristocrats are now attributed to everyone. So for example, the right to a jury of your peers, the right to be tried by your peers, was a right that used to be only attributed to aristocrats, and now we've attributed to everyone. So we've elevated everyone to a high rank. But Waldron also emphasizes that part of what it is to recognize the high rank of humans is to recognize their supremacy over animals. And this is fundamental to Waldron's conception of human dignity. So he says, this is a lengthy quote, "In a world which respects human dignity, the law may force people to do things, but even when this happens, they are not herded like cattle, broken like horses, beaten like dumb animals, or reduced to a quivering mass of bestial desperate terror. This is because dignitarian politics requires attending to the point of view of humans. Dignitarian politics is a mode of governance that acknowledges that people likely have a view or perspective of their own to present on the application of a social norm to their conduct. Applying a norm to a human individual is not like deciding what to do about a rabid animal or a dilapidated house. It involves paying attention to a point of view. This means that governing humans with dignity is quite different, say, from herding cows with a cattle prod, since the latter is a system of rule that works by manipulating, terrorizing, or galvanizing behavior. So violating dignity, on his account, involves treatment that is more fit for an animal than for a human, treatment of a person as though he were an animal. It's treatment that is insufficiently sensitive to the differences between humans and animals, in virtue of which humans have a special status. So, for example, a human is degraded by being bred like an animal, used as a beast of burden, beaten like an animal, herded like an animal. So that's all quotes from Waldron. So in his world, in his image, dignitarian politics involves treating humans as individuals who have a point of view and who therefore need to be, whose point of view needs to be taken into account. And then there are animals who we beat and terrorize and break. Okay, so in all of these accounts, human dignity is defended on the backs of animals. And I want to repeat again that I'm not saying that everyone who talks about the importance of human dignity is committed to this kind of species hierarchy. There are other ways of talking about dignity that doesn't involve species hierarchy. But I think it's striking that there are so many recent, and these are just a sample of some of recent legal and philosophical theories of human rights that quite explicitly reassert species hierarchy. And I think it's not an accident that they're using the concept of dignity as the basis for reasserting species hierarchy. So one way to think about this is that in the 80s and 90s and into the 2000s, as I said, we had this kind of rich toolkit for discussing human rights. We had ideas of needs and interests, ideas of vulnerability, of subjectivity, of capabilities, of precarious life. And all of those seem naturally, to many of us, to extend to animals. And so insofar as, let's say, you know, in Waldron's world, so we're terrorizing cows, that, you know, clearly this is a harm to their interests, it's undermining their capabilities, it's rendering them vulnerable, it's making their lives more precarious, and insofar as any of those concepts are what underpin human rights, they seem prima facie to be applicable to animals. But dignity, it's less clear to many people whether the problem with our mistreatment of animals is about a violation of their dignity. This is actually, it's a question that gets discussed in the animal ethics literature. People have different views about it, but, you know, so if you intensively confine pigs, again, it's clear it's harmful, it renders them vulnerable and precarious and so on. Is it a violation of their dignity? It's not the natural idiom in which even animal rights advocates themselves talk about animal rights. And so I think it's not a surprise that human supremacists, those who want to reassert species hierarchy, they're confronted with this moral toolbox, right? It's not surprising that they pick the category of the concept of dignity, because I think it's the one that's least likely to generalize to animals. So I think these new dignitarians pick the concept of dignity precisely because they think it's the one that's least likely to extend to animals. And this isn't just my, you know, conspiracy theory about why they're picking the concept of dignity. This is what they themselves say. So here's a quote from George Ktab. He recognizes, here's a quote. There's a tendency to picture humanity as just another animal species among other animal species, with some particularities, even uniqueness, but none so commendable as to elevate humanity above the rest. And he goes on to say, this unnecessarily tarnishes human dignity by taking away commendable uniqueness from it. The notion of human stature is directed in part against these reductions in the name of human dignity. So the point of dignity is to contest these trends to picture humanity as just one amongst other species. And here's another quote from Thomas Williams, who's another one of these new dignitarians. He says, we must invoke human dignity to counteract the tendency of the experimental in human sciences to ever more emphasize the continuity between man and other creatures. So what both Ktab and Williams are saying is, I mean, it's actually striking. They're both acknowledging that all the empirical evidence from both the natural sciences and the human sciences are showing continuities between humans and animals. They acknowledge that. All the evidence is showing more and more continuities between humans and other animals. So you might think that we should therefore look for moral concepts that acknowledge those continuities. But they draw the opposite conclusion. They say, okay, if all the evidence is showing continuities, we need a concept that we can use to reassert discontinuity. And they think the dignity gives them that concept. Dignity is the justification for ignoring all the evidence about continuities between humans and animals. That is their own justification for appealing to the idea of dignity. Okay, so I think we're at a crossroads in the moment of human rights, in the human rights project, that for the first time really I think since 1948, the Human Rights Project is being invited to reinscribe human supremacy into the foundations of human rights. I think we'd kind of gotten away from that from the 80s to the 2000s, and key theorists are inviting us to bring back human supremacy into the foundation of human rights. Okay, so I think this is terrible. It's very worrisome. I think it would be, if this takes root, I think it's going to be a catastrophe for animals, but I also think it's bad for humans, and I think it's bad for the Human Rights Project generally. So there's a lot to say about what's wrong with building human supremacy into the core of human rights, but let me just focus on one issue. So I think part of what's going wrong here, so we can think about there are various motivations for appealing to human supremacy in the defense of human rights. Some of it's just species narcissism. It's just the desire, some people just want to elevate the human above the animal just to pat themselves on the back as a species. But part of the reason for it is actually a more understandable one, which is that some people believe that species hierarchy is an important political value that can be invoked to protect disadvantaged human groups from dehumanization. I think this is a fundamental goal of many people in the Human Rights Project. So we all know that some groups of humans have been dehumanized. And some people think that the best strategy for overcoming dehumanization is by asserting species hierarchy. And I think that's a very important idea, and we need to grapple with it and see whether that's right or wrong. So I just think it rests on a misdiagnosis of what dehumanization involves and how we should overcome it. But I think it's worth thinking through. Okay, so what is dehumanization? So dehumanization is not literally the belief that someone is not a member of the human species. Like that's everyone. When blacks or immigrants or refugees, or women or gay people or people with disabilities are dehumanized, it's not that people don't recognize they're members of the human species, that they're Homo sapiens. Dehumanization is actually it's a more complicated phenomenon. What it is failing to recognize. It's about what are the characteristics we attribute to people, and in general, everyone recognizes that we share certain characteristics with other animals. These are often called primary qualities, like for example, pleasure and fear. Everyone recognizes that many animals also feel pleasure and fear, so those are not uniquely human. But there are some qualities that are seen, rightly or wrongly, as uniquely human. For example, shame, or regret, or curiosity. These are often seen as uniquely human. And so dehumanization involves viewing the members of a particular group as only having those attributes that we share with animals, and being less likely to attribute to them those uniquely human qualities, such as shame or regret. And this has been shown over and over again. There's a huge empirical literature on dehumanization, and it is true, indeed true, that this is a very important feature of how dehumanization works, is that we don't attribute to the members of certain groups these uniquely human qualities. We instead ascribe to them these more basic primary characteristics that are shared with other animals. And this is a problem. This is a genuine problem. It's not just a source of stereotypes and hence prejudices and hence discrimination, but it also tends to lead to violence, to coercion. Because if you think that someone doesn't have these uniquely human capabilities, it's more likely that you're going to think that you need to govern them by force, through cattle prods. So, and the way in which the police treat young black men in the United States is a paradigm example of this, that the young black men are dehumanized, they're seen as being governed by these unruly animal instincts, and so that they need to be managed through force. So again, this has been shown in a wide number of contexts that dehumanization produces not just prejudice and discrimination, but force and coercion. So it's a real problem. So the question is, how do we overcome dehumanization? So I think it's right. If you're a human rights advocate, I think we should be thinking, how can human rights overcome dehumanization? So the assumption that many people have is that the best way to fight dehumanization is to assert a species hierarchy, and indeed to make the species hierarchy steeper, so that the best way is to essentially to sanctify the human and to instrumentalize the animal, such that it then so that we can then say, when someone is mistreating a member of a disadvantaged group, you shouldn't be treating a human that way, right? You're treating them like an animal, but you should be treating them like a human, and humans are sacred, they're sanctified. So people think that a steep species hierarchy works to the benefit of the members of disadvantaged groups. It gives them this elevated status of the human, which we have sanctified through species hierarchy. And so just to repeat, this is a hypothesis. The hypothesis is that strengthening ideas of species hierarchy works to the political benefit of members of disadvantaged groups by giving them this sanctified status of being human, and by making it clear why it's wrong to treat them like an animal. Okay, so I think that's an understandable view. And if it were true, if that hypothesis was correct, I think we would actually be in a bit of a moral bind, because it would suggest that there's a trade-off between what's an effective strategy for protecting the rights of disadvantaged groups and what we need to fight for animal rights. And then we'd be in a bind, right? However, as it happens, I just think it's empirically wrong that species hierarchy works to fight dehumanization. This is an empirical question. It's a social science question. What is the impact of a belief in species hierarchy on attitudes and behavior towards the members of outgroups? And as it happens, this has been studied in many different contexts, and all the evidence shows that strengthening species hierarchy is bad for dehumanization. It makes it worse. So this has been studied in any number of ways. So we know that there's various scales out there for studying people's assessment of species hierarchy. Those who more strongly believe in species hierarchy are more likely to be prejudiced against racial minorities, against refugees, against women, against people with disabilities. And this is not just a statistical correlation, it's actually causal. So they've done these neat experiments in which they divide the room in half, and the people on this side get a newspaper article talking about how science has shown that humans and animals are much more continuous than we thought, that lots of things that we used to thought of as uniquely human are in fact shared by many animal species. And this side of the room gets a newspaper article about how science has shown that human uniqueness, that humans really are unique, and that we have these unique capabilities. And then people are asked, after having read this article, about their attitudes towards various outgroups. And those who got the story about human-animal continuities expressed much more respect for rights of outgroups than those who got the story about species hierarchy. And this has been replicated not just amongst adults, but amazingly amongst children. Like, you do the same experiment with 8-year-olds, and the 8-year-olds who are taught species hierarchy express greater prejudice against racial minorities. It's extraordinary. So I think all the evidence shows that species hierarchy exacerbates rather than reduces dehumanization, right? So if we want a human rights practice that works to fight dehumanization, I think we need to reduce, not expand species hierarchy. I think that's what the social science evidence shows. So that may seem puzzling to you, and if you're interested, we could talk in the question period about what are the mechanisms that underpin this. The social psychologists who do these studies were not surprised. It fits exactly what their underlying theories about how prejudice works. But rather than talk about those theories of social psychology, let me just give you an example, which I think helps to illustrate why we shouldn't be surprised. that species hierarchy exacerbates dehumanization. So here's a concrete case. That in the United States and Canada lately, one of the big issues has been about solitary confinement. And we know that solitary confinement of prisoners is rooted in dehumanization. That the people who are put in solitary confinement are viewed as animals who need to be caged. And these are often there's a huge racial disparity in this, so it's often people of color who are subject to this. So this is seen as a major human rights issue in North America. And when people try to persuade citizens and the government that this is a human rights problem, the use of solitary confinement, people note the similarities between solitary confinement of prisoners and putting animals in a cage in a zoo. That parallel is ubiquitous in the literature and the advocacy, including the legal cases around solitary confinement. But you can imagine two different ways of talking about that analogy between the solitary confinement of prisoners and putting animals in cages in a zoo. A supremacist way of doing it and a non-supremacist way of drawing that analogy. So the non-supremacist version would say that there are continuities between these two cases, continuities in the harms and the wrongs, because it's wrong to take any sentient member of a social species and isolate them. That's a form of social death that's being imposed on the animal in a cage in a zoo, just as it's a form of social death being imposed on the prisoner in solitary confinement. So that it's wrong to take a member of any social species and impose this form of social death on them. And that if people were thought seriously about what's wrong about putting animals in a cage in a zoo, they would understand what's wrong about putting humans in solitary confinement. So that's the non-supremacist version of drawing the analogy between zoos and solitary confinement. The supremacist version says there's nothing wrong with putting animals in a cage in a zoo. The problem with putting humans in solitary confinement is that we're not elevating the human above the animal. That dignity requires treating humans as better than animals. So while it's okay to do this to animals, it's not okay to do it to humans, because that's not recognizing the unique superiority of humans over the animal. Which means, so what's wrong with solitary confinement is not that it's a form of social death, it's not that it leads to various forms of mental illness, it leads to various kinds of mental trauma and post-traumatic stress disorder, because all of that's true about animals as well. Those aren't the reasons why it's wrong to treat humans this way. It's because we're not sufficiently respecting human dignity, this thing that distinguishes us from humans from animals. So I'm curious to know your reaction. Which do you think is the most effective way of trying to persuade people that there's something wrong with solitary confinement? Is it by highlighting the continuities between the wrongs that's involved in zoos and solitary confinement, or is it instead by appealing to this supremacist idea of human dignity? So my hunch is that if we got people to understand what's wrong with keeping animals in zoos, it would be much easier to persuade people that solitary confinement is wrong. I think that I don't know that any. Yeah. Okay. So here's just a quote from Lisa Gunther, who's written on this issue. She's written a very effective critique of solitary confinement, but she argues that we need to move beyond supremacy, human supremacy, and if we want to understand what's wrong with solitary confinement, we need to understand why it's also wrong to engage in impose social death on animals. So here's a quote: "The disastrous effects of being radically deprived of the concrete experience of other living beings suggests that there's nothing exclusively human about the need for everyday intercorporeal experience. It is not primarily as human beings with a presumably inherent sense of dignity and freedom that we are affected by solitary confinement and sensory deprivation, but as living beings, sensible flesh, with corporeal relations to other embodied beings and to an open field of overlapping experience in a shared world. It is as animals that we are damaged or even destroyed by solitary confinement, just as our fellow animals are damaged or destroyed by confinement at zoos, factory farms, and scientific labs. We cannot fully understand the brutality of these programs until we refuse to accept that dogs or other animals deserve to be treated this way any more than humans do. So that's just an example. I could give others. I mean, if I had time, I don't. I think it's a very similar case about the example of work, which I mentioned before. It's ubiquitous in the literature on the human rights of workers to say that humans should not be treated as beasts of burden. This is ubiquitous in the literature on labor rights. And again, you could have a supremacist and a non-supremacist way of making that argument. I would say that if we want to persuade people it's wrong to treat humans as beasts of burden, we should get people to understand why it's wrong to treat animals as beasts of burden. And that this would be a much more effective way of generating support for the human rights of all people. Okay, so I don't have any more time. There's much more to say, but let me just, I think that, as I say, we're sort of at this crossroads in the human rights project. And as I say, for the first time since 1948, there's this very concerted, widespread effort to reinsert human supremacy into the theory and practice of human rights. And I think we need to resist it. And partly because it's going to be really bad for animals, but also because I think it's going to be bad for a lot of human groups. And this is one of many ways in which I think the struggle for human rights and animal rights is complementary. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Kymlicka. Very interesting conference. Okay, questions. And we take two in rounds of two. First of all, please. Yes.
Thank you. I have two very quick questions. The first one is, what do you think about linking this project of the making human rights without humanism with the literature on human rights, or the political account of human rights? I'm thinking of Charles Weitz, Raz, even John Rawls, people who think that human rights are actually linked to the legitimacy of governments, and they are not that worried about the foundations of human rights as such. And the second one is on whether you think that we should try to change the vocabulary in the public discourse of human rights, trying to find an umbrella term for human and animal rights, and then promote it as changing the discourse of human rights itself.
And the second one?
Thank you. Just a quick question. Do you think in the minds of the dignitarians that they can imagine a world where we don't treat animals the way that we do? And if that's possible, and surely they can't think that we must treat animals terribly, then what's left in that theory? Because if we didn't instrumentalise animals, then what good would that distinction do? And then what would be the grounds for human rights?
Yeah, so good. So on the first question, in my own work, I'm very sympathetic to political accounts of human rights, which tie them to, so for those who aren't familiar with this debate, there's an older way of thinking about human rights, which is you sort of take an abstract human being and you say, what do I owe this other human being, just in kind of in a context-free, without any description of the context or any history, just what do I as an abstract human being owe another abstract human being? That's an old way of thinking about human rights. The political way of human rights is asking what's the function that we want international norms of human rights to serve, and or what are the problems we're trying to remedy through the framework of human rights, and in particular, how does it, what role does it play in ensuring the legitimacy of political institutions? So I'm very sympathetic to that political account. I think we need to bring in this institutional context in order to make sense of what we want human rights to achieve, and I think that the animal rights fits perfectly in that, because animals are subject to our governance. They're subject to our institutions, and I think that their interests fit within a political account of rights. Whether we can or should come up with whether we should stop talking about human rights and animal rights, instead just thinking about an umbrella term like sentient rights. So Alistair Cochrane has an article called Towards Sentient Rights, in which he suggests that that's what we should have as a kind of meta-frame, that there are certain rights that are owed to all sentient beings. I'm not averse to that. I think from a certain kind of philosophical point of view, there's a logic to it. But I'm also not committed to it. I think that we could, if we ended up having, a Universal Declaration of Human Rights and a Universal Declaration of Animal Rights, I don't think that's necessarily wrong, that we're addressing them in two different documents and under two different headings. It would obviously depend on what the substantive content is. On whether the new dignitarians are committed to mistreating animals, actually, that's a very good question. Waldron, when he talks about terrorizing cows with cattle prods, it's pretty clear he thinks that's legitimate. But is he committed to saying that we should be doing that? And if he accepts that we might one day overcome that, what then would be the distinction between? It's actually a very good question, and I would invite people to read Waldron or Ktab, and I'd be curious to know what people think. I actually, in Waldron's case, and he's not alone in this, there is some religious underpinning, and so on some accounts of Christianity, God gave us animals to use, and that it's actually, so therefore we're kind of fulfilling God's plan when we instrumentalize animals. Obviously there are lots of Christians who strongly dispute that, and there are various ways of interpreting the text and so on. But so I think that for many of these dignitarians, it's not at all clear that they would want to move to a world in which we weren't instrumentalizing animals. This idea, we sanctify the human. It's a very strong part of this whole framework that our dignity consists in our superiority over animals, and so I don't think they would be keen to give up on that.
Okay, another question, another two questions? No? We are over time. Oh, okay. It's a shame. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Kymlicka. Totally agree with you. Yeah, it's a big problem. Conception of the human politic. Here in Mexico's tradition, a people who has a lot of work, he or she say of himself or herself, I work like a donkey. I work like a person. It's terrible. It's terrible. Anthropocentric and racist language in Mexico is very, very common.
It's depressing sometimes.
We have a project in the